Marcus had been Seriva Vailthan's designated armor technician for 14 months, which was long enough to know her equipment better than his own quarters, and long enough to understand that her silences were not all the same. The Thessari warrior caste produced people who were precise in ways that made most other species look approximate. Not unkind. Seriva had never been unkind to him, but operating according to a framework where composure was not a performance of strength, but the actual structure of it, load-bearing and non-negotiable. She was tall in the way Thessari commanders tended to be, not imposing through bulk, but through the particular economy of someone who had never in their life moved without intention. Her features were the kind that made humans sometimes fumble their sentences, though Marcus had long since processed past that particular adjustment. What registered now was just the quality of her attention when she gave it, and the specific texture of her silences when she didn't. She'd been coming to him for maintenance after every deployment for over a year. The arrangement had settled into something both of them understood without needing to discuss. He worked, she allowed him to work, the armor came out better for it, and neither of them required anything from the other beyond professional competence. Today's session had begun the same way all of them began. She arrived at the maintenance bay at the scheduled time, set down the armor components she'd already detached for easier access, and positioned herself for the work that required her to remain present while he worked on the chest and shoulder plating. Marcus had read the damage patterns before she arrived. He always reviewed the deployment logs enough to understand what the armor had been through, because equipment told the truth about operations in ways that official reports sometimes smoothed. This deployment had been harder than it looked in summary. The impact stress on the shoulder plating alone told a story about hours of sustained pressure. He'd set out the tools for a thorough session, not a quick assessment, a real one. He began with the outer plating, methodical, quiet, working the way he always worked, which was the way she'd come to expect from him, which was fine. He didn't need her to appreciate his methodology. He just needed her equipment to function properly. He found the moisture about 40 minutes in. Left chest plating, interior section, along the lower seam where the armor sat closest to the body. Marcus's first thought was what it should have been. Condensation, possibly a microfracture in the coolant line beneath, minor seal compromise from the operation stress. He cataloged it, continued his current work, planned to return to it in the natural sequence. When he did return to it, he ran the investigation that a potential coolant issue required. Coolant lines, intact. No trace chemical indicators. Seal integrity, holding within normal parameters. Temperature differential sufficient for condensation at this location, not present. Marcus stopped. He kept his hands moving, kept doing the things his hands were supposed to be doing in this section, but his attention had shifted to the stain with a new kind of focus. Coolant followed physics. It pooled at low points, spread from failure sites, left residue his instruments were specifically calibrated to detect. Condensation followed temperature gradients, distributed across surfaces in predictable patterns. This stain moved differently. He had seen staining like this before, in field conditions, on soldiers after particular kinds of operations, on people who were carrying things that the armor around them, the metaphorical kind, the kind that duty and rank and years of training built, had held together long enough to complete the mission, and then, in the relative privacy of aftermath, had shown the cost. He did not look up. He kept his eyes on his instruments, his hands on the appropriate components, his expression on the appropriate setting for a technician doing routine work. He was aware, with the specific peripheral awareness that 14 months of working in Seriva's silences had developed, that she hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't shifted her posture in any way that would indicate awareness of his awareness. She was holding herself with the same absolute composure she always held herself with. Except the armor knew something she hadn't said, and now Marcus knew it too, and he had approximately 3 seconds to decide what to do with that knowledge. He could finish the section at normal pace, close the plating, move to the next sequence. The moisture didn't indicate mechanical failure. His work order didn't require additional time here. He could say something. He dismissed this in the same second it occurred to him. 14 months of understanding how Seriva Veilthan was built told him with complete certainty that acknowledging what he'd seen would be a violation of something fundamental. It would require her to either deny it, which was its own kind of indignity, the forced performance of a lie neither of them would believe, or to acknowledge it, which her entire framework around what a warrior commander was and could be in front of a subordinate wouldn't permit. He took the third option. He slowed down, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, just slightly, the difference between thorough and very thorough, the difference between adequate attention and the kind of careful work that would hold up to the closest inspection. He found additional things worth examining in this section. The underlayer padding showed compression in the lower quadrant that warranted closer assessment. Impact absorption material degraded in ways that weren't always obvious from the outside, and this area had clearly taken stress. The interior seal would benefit from a more careful application than standard protocol required. The temperature regulation panel behind the chest plating was more accessible from this angle than it would be when he rotated to the back panels. He might as well address it now. His hands moved steadily through each of these things. His instruments assessed, documented, applied where application was needed. His face held the particular neutral focus of a technician whose attention was entirely on the work. He kept the chest plating open. The open seam required him to remain in close proximity to this section, required his tools and his hands to occupy the space immediately adjacent to where Seriva was standing in the stillness she'd held since she arrived. Not crowding her, maintaining the professional distance that their arrangement required, but present, occupied, working. It shielded the open section in a way that to any observer would simply look like thorough work. She was not alone with what she was carrying. She was also not required to name it. He gave her the time the standard sequence wouldn't have provided. Not indefinite. He was a technician with a work order, and eventually the section would be complete regardless of how thorough his attention. But more time than thoroughness strictly required. Time in which neither of them had to acknowledge anything. Marcus sealed the chest plating eventually, with the same care he brought to all her equipment. Everything he'd found, he'd addressed. Everything he'd addressed would hold. He moved to the right shoulder, the section with the most significant impact stress, the one that would require the most actual technical attention of the session. He didn't vary his pace in any way that marked the transition as different from any other transition between sections. Just moved and assessed and worked. By the time he reached the back panels, the final section of a complete maintenance assessment, the quality of Seriva's stillness had shifted. He couldn't have explained it to anyone who didn't already understand her silences, because it wasn't visible in any way that language described well. But he had spent 14 months in this maintenance bay with her, and the stillness she held now was not the same as the one she'd arrived with. The one she'd arrived with had weight, a specific kind of weight, the active kind, the kind that required effort to sustain. What she held now was quieter, not absent of weight, but the weight was different. The way pressure changes when something that's been held very tightly is given enough room to stop requiring quite so much active containment. She spoke once, when Marcus was completing the final documentation check. The seal on the left chest interior. 3 words: flat, professional. The tone she used for equipment assessments, for operational queries, for the kind of statement that existed in the register of their work together. Good seal, Marcus said, entering data without looking up. No integrity concerns. He paused, finishing the entry. Underlayer padding in that section showed compression beyond standard parameters, gave it additional attention. 3 seconds of silence. The particular 3 seconds of someone receiving information and deciding what to do with it. Noted, she said. He finished the documentation. set his instruments to their storage positions, completed the final checks that concluded a maintenance session. She stood, the armor complete and sealed, ready for whatever came next. As she turned to leave, she paused. The length of a pause that someone holds when they're deciding whether to say something. Then she continued walking. Marcus did not watch her go. He turned to his next task and gave it the same methodical focus he gave everything. Later, alone in the maintenance bay in the specific quiet that followed her departures, Marcus allowed himself to sit with what the session had actually contained. Not the armor work. The armor work was routine, documented, filed, complete. The other thing. The thing where a warrior who held a command rank that prohibited the acknowledgement of certain kinds of weight had been given, inside a maintenance session that looked exactly like all the others. Enough time and enough shielded space to carry that weight without being forced to name it, defend it, or explain it to anyone. The thing where the only person who'd seen had decided, with full awareness of the choice he was making, to see it quietly. To let knowledge sit as knowledge rather than turning it into a conversation or a comfort or a gesture of sympathy that would have required her to respond to it. He wasn't sure what to call what he'd done. It wasn't a kindness in the way humans usually meant kindness. It didn't offer anything, didn't reach toward her, didn't ask for acknowledgement in return. It was more like a decision about what kind of person he was going to be in a moment where being a different kind of person had also been available to him. He'd chosen to be the kind who protected someone's dignity when they were most exposed, without requiring them to know they needed protection. In the months that followed, nothing changed about their arrangement on the surface. Seriva arrived for maintenance on schedule. She stood or sat as positioning required. She didn't engage in conversation beyond operational necessity. Marcus worked in the silence they'd both found functional over 14 months of working together. But the silence was different now. Not warmer exactly. Warmth wasn't quite the right word for what the Thessari warrior caste produced, even in their most trusting arrangements. Something more structural than warmth. More like the quality of a foundation that's been tested in a way neither party has named, and has held, and is now part of the underlying architecture of how two people occupy space together under difficult conditions. There was a session, 7 months later, when the damage patterns on her armor told a story that made the deployment reports look even more sanitized than usual. Marcus read the story and worked without comment, as he always worked. At the end of that session, she said something slightly outside their usual register. "The work is consistently well done." Marcus looked up from his documentation, actually looked up, which he rarely did at the end of sessions. "The armor's worth doing well," he said, a pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "Yes," she said. She left. Marcus turned back to his documentation and noted, without noting it in any official record, that something about the exchange had the quality of an acknowledgment. Not of anything specific, not of anything that had ever been named, but of the general architecture of what the last 21 months of maintenance sessions had actually been about. He'd never mention what he saw in the armor's interior that day. He would never need to. She knew what he'd seen. She knew what he'd chosen. And that knowledge, unspoken, unacknowledged in any official register, existing only in the particular quality of the silence they'd built together, had become load-bearing in a way that most relationships took years to achieve and some never did. Not through words, not through comfort offered and received, through the specific and deliberate choice, made once in a maintenance bay during a difficult session, to recognize someone's pain without forcing it into the light, and in that recognition, to hand them back their dignity intact. That was the thing Marcus Hale had understood, working quietly on Thessari battle armor in a small bay on a border station. That trust, at its most essential, was sometimes built not by what you said, but by what you chose, with full understanding, to leave unsaid.